Sonthonax continued to rule with sternness in the north, the whites solemnly accepting the victory of the revolution, the mulattoes grabbing greedily at all government posts. Sonthonax, though later he would be disgusted with this greediness, leaned on them and deported for trial in France all who smelt of counter-revolution. Just at this time there arrived from France Gabald, appointed governor in place of de Blanchelande, arrested and sent to France by Sonthonax. When Gabald reached Le Cap, Sonthonax was at Port-au-Prince visiting Paul Varel. The whites of Le Cap, nearly all for the counter-revolution, gave Gabald, who had property in San Domingo, a tumultuous welcome. Sonthonax and Paul Varel knew what this meant, and hurrying from Port-au-Prince, dismissed Gabald and his staff and put them on a vessel to be taken to France. But Gabald was not going so easily. The sailors in the fleet took his part. He landed with a force. The whites of the counter-revolution joined him, and together they drove out the commissioners and their forces out of the city. Sonthonax is at Le Cap or Port-au-Prince. Sonthonax, facing defeat and extermination, gave orders that the slaves and the prisoners of Le Cap should be armed, at the same time promising pardon and freedom to the insurgent slaves who surrounded the city. Sonthonax unloosed the lot at Gabald, and the whites, Gabald's sailors, drunk with victory and with wine, had just turned from fighting to pillage when 10,000 blacks swooped down from the hills onto the city. The road from the heights ran along the seashore, and the sailors who remained on the ships in the harbor could see them hour after hour swarming down to Le Cap. The counter-revolution fled for the harbor, leaving all behind them. Gabald had to throw himself into the sea to get to a boat and to complete the royalist discomfiture. Fire broke out and burnt 2/3 of the city to the ground, destroying hundreds of millions worth of property. 10,000 refugees crowded onto the vessels in the harbor and set out for the United States of America, the great majority of them never to return. It was the end of the white domination in San Domingo. That's how white San Domingo destroyed itself. The current legend that the abolition of slavery resulted in the destruction of the whites is a shameless lie, typical of the means by which reaction covers its crimes in the past and seeks to block advance in the present. In May 1792, the whites were all tumbling over each other to give rights to the mulattoes, and Roume says that when the decree of April 4th arrived, they published it the day after. It was too late. If they had done it a year before at the outbreak of the slave revolution, they would have been able to master it before it spread. Why didn't they? Race prejudice? Nonsense. Why did not Charles I and his followers behave reasonably to Cromwell? As late as 1646, 2 years after Marston's Moor, Mrs. Cromwell and Mrs. Ireton had tea with Charles at Hampton Court. Cromwell, great revolutionary but great bourgeoisie, was willing to come to terms. Why did not Louis and Marie Antoinette in the court behave reasonably to the moderate revolutionaries before August 10th? Why indeed the monarchy in France had to be torn up by the roots? Those in power never give way and admit defeat only to plot and scheme to regain their lost power and privilege. Had the monarchist been white, the bourgeoisie brown, and the masses of France black, the French Revolution would have gone down in history as a race war. But although they were all white in France, they fought just the same. The struggle of classes ends either in the reconstruction of society or in the common ruin of the contending classes. The French Revolution laid the basis of modern France, the country as a whole being strong enough to stand the shock and profit by it. But so corrupt and rotten was the slave society of San Domingo that it could not stand any strain and perished as it deserved to perish. Sonthonax returned to Le Cap, a town half ruined. To his surprise, the pillage over the revolted slaves did not stay with the commissioners. Gathering up their plunder, they went back to their roving life in the hills and to their Spanish allies. The French sent envoys to win them over, but all of them, Toussaint included, replied that they could only obey a king. They could only obey a king. And they would only recognize the commissioners when they had a king. Which piece of sophistry had been carefully taught them by the Spaniards. The royalist officers were deserting Sonthonax for the Spaniards, and now to complete the difficulties of the commissioners, the slaves who had not yet revolted, kindled by the revolutionary ferment around them, refused to be slaves any longer. They crowded the streets of Le Cap, exulted as at a revivalist meeting, and called for liberty and equality on plantations which had hitherto escaped destruction. It was the same. The white slave owners who remained in San Domingo had learnt much in the last 2 years. One of them, who owned hundreds of slaves, told Sonthonax that it would be best to declare abolition. Sonthonax learnt that Jean-Francois Francois was about to rally the blacks to his standard by calling them all to liberty, hemmed in on all sides and looking for support against the enemy at home and the enemy abroad. Sonthonax declared the abolition of slavery on August 29th, 1793. It was his last card, and he could not help himself. Isn't that what that German said in Django? Couldn't help myself. In the West Province, Paul Varel, although dissatisfied, accepted the decree and persuaded the whites who remained not to oppose it. For the time being, having no other alternative, they accepted, but the decree was a failure. Those freed by Sonthonax remained always faithful to him, but Jean-Francois Biassou and other experienced soldiers remained in alliance with the Spaniards. Jean-Francois Biassou, what's up? Just love that Spaniard. And Toussaint, although I know Catalonia I love that Catalonia. And Toussaint, though not faithful to the Spaniards, still refused to go over to the French. In the South, the slaves had revolted against both whites and mulattoes and were winning great victories. But in the West, the mulattoes were still dominant. Rigaud and Beauvais, with their white allies, had long since captured Port-au-Prince, chasing the royalists away. The mulatto army established a mulatto domination, but when the fighting was over, they chose some of the bravest slaves and offered them freedom if they would lead the rest back to slavery and keep them in order. The offer was accepted, and 100,000 slaves were led back to their plantations, the inevitable fate of any class which allows itself to be led by another. Sure of their slaves, many of the mulatto proprietors in the West, though having the government in their hands, were furious at the decree of abolition and abandoned the revolution to which they owed so much. Property, white and mulatto, had come together again under the flag of counter-revolution, because they're reactionary, racist sons of regressive, dirty, rotten